Hello everyone. This is the first episode in a Jesus Journey series that I have prepared to demonstrate the logic of Jesus living at the Essene monastery at Qumran by the Dead Sea instead of at Nazareth near the Sea of Galilee. The proof is shown by the length of each of the journeys. In fact, the sum total of all the journey lengths for the traditional Jerusalem-centered locations is 3,093 kilometers versus only 330 kilometers for the more logical Qumran-centered locations. This is almost 10 times greater. Okay, you may ask why this matters and why I wrote a program to simulate Jesus' journeys. Aside from the fun of watching Jesus and Mary and the donkey navigate the modern roads using Google Maps, the point to be made is that if Jerusalem was the mirrored image of Jerusalem, then perhaps we need to look more closely at the New Testament. In fact, it can be found that there are actually two word forms, the singular noun of Jerusalem standing for Jerusalem proper, and the plural form standing for Qumran. In this episode, Joseph and Mary will travel simultaneously from Nazareth to Bethlehem by donkey, traveling at 3 kilometers per hour. In the Qumran journey, the donkey will travel from Ein Feshka, which is Nazareth, to the Queen's house, certainly an appropriate name that is mentioned in the Copper Scroll, located just 1 kilometer south of Qumran, which is thus Jerusalem. You might say that this is cheating to give a different location for Bethlehem, but the scholars have already tried this by proposing that there was a Bethlehem closer to Nazareth. It has always been strange to imagine that Mary, already close to term, would have to travel such a great distance just to be taxed. Now we're setting up the journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And now we're setting up the journey from Ein Feshka to the Queen's house. Ready, set, go, and they're off. Mary is heading out on the donkey from Nazareth, and it looks like they're making good time. But wait, what is that I hear? Mary is cheering that she has reached the Queen's house at Qumran, so let's cut to that journey right now. Mary is leaving on the donkey from Ein Feshka, and she has now arrived at the Queen's house. The journey has taken 55 minutes, and it's 1.7 miles. As the Nazareth donkey continues the journey, it gives us a chance to discuss the discrepancies on Jesus' birth between the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke both agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but Luke is the one that has the long trip from Nazareth to Bethlehem. On the dates of the birth, Matthew says that Jesus was born in the days of King Herod, which means that, since Herod died in 4 BC, Jesus had to be born before that. Luke has the census under the governor Cyrenius, which is clearly documented in 6 AD. Scholars just say that Luke made a mistake, but since he was the companion of St. Paul, that is impossible. The only way that these dates can be reconciled is to understand that the birth in Luke is a symbolic birth, and therefore Jesus' bar mitzvah at 12, which pushes the date of Jesus' birth back to 7 BC, still within Herod's reign. The correspondence of Nazareth to Ein Feshka on the Dead Sea is more logical, not only because of the distances, but because it is close to the desert region where the Nazarites, who would spend 40 days in the wilderness in between family life, as Jesus did, would have lived. The issue of Jesus being born when Mary was merely espoused to Joseph will be covered in a later episode, but it must be noted that Luke carefully used the tense of espoused as having been espoused, which is in line with the symbolic birth, since 12 years after Jesus' birth, Mary would certainly be married and have a son, James, with Joses on the way. At this point, we will cut the Nazareth journey at 22 hours and resume at 50 hours. And we are just passing Jerusalem. At this point, it looks like Joseph has had trouble with the Israeli-Palestinian border guards, as the road appears to have stopped. But the enterprising donkey has found the way to the manger at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Total time for the Jerusalem-based trip is 52.29 hours. That's 156.87 kilometers and 97.47 miles, which is a long way for Mary to have traveled by donkey in her advanced state of pregnancy. Hello again, everyone. Glad that you are following my Jesus Journeys series. This second episode shows Mary's Annunciation trip to visit Elizabeth, soon to give birth to John the Baptist. Now we're setting up the journey from Nazareth to the hill country of Judea, considered to be Mird. And now we're setting up the journey from Ein Feshka to Mird. Ready, set, go, and they're off. Mary sets off from Nazareth, not looking forward to the long journey to Mird, all by herself. But wait, I already hear Elizabeth welcoming Mary from Ein Feshka, so let's switch to that journey right now. Mary sets off from Ein Feshka. She has made this journey many times, but she is looking forward to visiting with Elizabeth because she has many things to talk to her about. And there she is, arriving at Mird. It's a distance of 6.41 kilometers, and it took her 4 hours. So we'll resume our journey now with Mary coming from Nazareth. The Essene rules did not allow sexual relations. However, in an effort to preserve the kingly and priestly lines, it was necessary to allow these men to have trial marriages, and if the espoused wife bore a child, then they would be officially married to her. But if not, they would find another. These lineages had to be preserved at all costs. So you would have supposed that Joseph would be overjoyed to find he had a child. But there was one minor problem. Mary was very religious and very fertile, as can be seen by her 5 sons, Jesus, James, Joses, Simon, and Judah. After Joseph and Mary's betrothal in June, Joseph decides that no one will find out and does not wait until December and has non-consensual sex with Mary. And now he is in trouble. He could pretend that someone else has raped her, and as Matthew says, he, as a just man, could have her expelled from the order. The leaders of the Essenes were called angels, and the leader then was Simeon, the angel, and he assured Joseph that he was forgiven because as the David king he was third in importance, and therefore he was merely acting as the Holy Spirit. While Joseph was considering his options, Mary, having missed her period, went off to the hill country of Judea to be comforted by Elizabeth, who was 6 months pregnant in June, according to the rules, soon to give birth to John the Baptist in September. However, Mary would give birth to Jesus in March. After this situation was resolved, there was still the problem that Jesus would technically always be the illegitimate child, only recognized by some. His younger brother James had none of these problems, because Joseph did not risk getting caught again. At this point, Mary has gone 80 kilometers and walked 44.5 hours. And actually, if this hasn't aborted the child, probably nothing will. So I think we should jump ahead to the end of the journey and calculate up the times of both journeys. Mary has now arrived at Mird from Nazareth. She has gone 145 kilometers, and it's taken her 81 hours. And this compares with the Qumran-based journey from Ein Feshka to Mird, which was 6.5 kilometers in 4 hours. Hello again, everyone. Glad that you are following my Jesus Journeys series. Episode 3 is about the presentation of Jesus 40 days after his birth. But there are quite a few problems with this situation. Foremost of these is the fact that Mary and Joseph, after the presentation, go back to Nazareth, and there's no word of a flight to Egypt. This lends credibility to the fact that Luke is actually talking about Jesus' bar mitzvah. So it's difficult to have a contest between the Jerusalem version of Jesus and the Qumran version of Jesus. So I have chosen to just show the journey of Mary and Joseph back from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. On the Qumran side, I am showing Mary coming back from the Qumran temple to Mird in the wilderness. And this is because the situation in Revelation certainly seems a lot like a bar mitzvah, where Mary is presenting her child. And then Caiaphas says that he's illegitimate, and this causes a big dispute, which is shown as Michael and the angels fighting against Satan, who is Caiaphas. Now we're setting up the journey from the Jerusalem temple to Bethlehem. And now we're setting up the journey from Qumran to Mird. Ready, set, go, and they're off! Mary begins her journey from the Jerusalem temple to Bethlehem. And there she is arriving at Bethlehem. Mary begins her trip from the Qumran temple to Mird. Mary completes her journey at Mird. The journey from the Jerusalem temple to Bethlehem was 7.98 kilometers, and it took 4.43 hours. The journey from the Qumran temple to Mird was 6.83 kilometers, and it took 3.79 hours. So you can see that the two journeys are pretty much the same distance. Hello again, everyone. Glad that you are following my Jesus Journeys series. In this episode 4, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are setting out by donkey to go to Egypt because they fear the wrath of Herod the Great. This time we will do the Qumran-centered journey first, going from Ein Feshka to Mird by donkey. And then we will set up the journey from Bethlehem to Egypt by donkey. Ready, set, go, and they're off! Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are setting out from Ein Feshka. It makes more sense that they should be going to Mird because this is the place where the therapeutes from Egypt have come to live, and there are many caves there to hide out from Herod the Great. And here they are already at Mird. And now we pick up the Jerusalem-centered journey from Bethlehem to Egypt, already in progress. The flight to Egypt is a construct of Matthew's Gospel, as is the visit of the Magi. And it is quite intriguing to think about the fact that since Matthew was the one who published the four Gospels to the world in 49 AD, that it was an attempt on his part to try to draw all the groups together that were forming into the Christian church. Magi were from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, which also included the Samaritans, and the therapeutes, who came originally from Cairo, were the ones that really were the founders of the Abbey concept of the Christian church. They have been on the road now for 12 hours and will jump ahead to 36 hours. That Herod would be capable of the slaughter of the innocents is certainly undeniable, because he became quite mad at the end of his reign and murdered many of his sons. However, the murdering of the firstborn seems to be an obvious attempt to try to associate Jesus with Moses. The symbology of Moses was very important to the therapeutes, who used to reenact the adventures of Moses and Joshua in terms of the crossing of the Red Sea and the River Jordan. In fact, the leader of the therapeutes, Thaddeus, was killed in a symbolic crossing of the Jordan River. This journey is now 42 hours and nearing completion. However, there is the issue of the fact that it is only to the border of Egypt and Israel. It is extremely hard to cross this border, as the Israeli and the Egyptian police are very strict about who they let across, and even someone as important as Joseph and Mary and Jesus will not have much of a chance of crossing. Here we are at the completion of the Jerusalem-based journey. It took 143.53 kilometers and 47.84 hours. The Qumran-based journey took 6.44 kilometers and took only 2.15 hours. Hello again, everyone. Glad that you are following my Jesus Journey series. Episode 5 is the journey that Jesus took to be baptized by John the Baptist. It is well established that John baptized in Bethabara because this is supported both by tradition and the fact that there were abundant springs in the area. And this area was just above the top of the Dead Sea, which again indicates that Qumran is a more preferred place for Jesus than in Jerusalem. We are setting up the Qumran journey from Ain Feshka to Bethabara. And now we're setting up the Jerusalem-centered journey from Nazareth to Bethabara. Ready, set, go, and they're off. Jesus begins his journey from Ain Feshka, and he passes by the Queen's house and Qumran as he heads north. Jesus arrives in Bethabara, and it has taken him 12 hours. Now we start the Jerusalem-based Jesus from Nazareth. In the Gospel of John, when John is asked by whose authority he baptizes, he denies that he is the Christ or Elijah, and refers to someone who is called the Standing One. And it is subtly indicated that this standing one is Jesus standing there. But actually it is a more profound concept. It is the concept of God being the one who is eternal and standing forever, and the one who will bring the restoration that John is talking about. This name was also coined by Simon Magus, who liked to think of himself as the representation of the standing one. At this point we have 14 hours into the journey, and we rejoin it at 55 hours. When Jesus came to be baptized by John the Baptist, it was clearly an effort on Jesus' part to align with John the Baptist. But John the Baptist would have no part of this. He did not like this idea of Jesus being the Christ, and made this ironic comment saying, "I have need to be baptized of thee, and comest thou to me?" Clearly at this point sides were drawn up, with Jesus on one side and John the Baptist on the other. And of course, the ones on Jesus' side were the ones that won out, because John the Baptist was arrested and executed, and his disciples were basically stolen by Jesus. Jesus arrives in Bethabara from Nazareth. It is 125.37 kilometers, and it took him 69.65 hours, whereas the Qumran version was just 21.49 kilometers and 12 hours. I hope you enjoyed this Jesus Journey animation. Hello again, everyone. Glad that you are following my Jesus Journey series. Episode 6 has to do with Jesus being introduced to his disciples. This was after the baptism by John, setting up the journey from Bethabara to Mazan on the Dead Sea. And now setting up the journey from Bethabara to Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee. Ready, set, go, and they're off. In the Qumran-centered journey, Jesus is leaving Bethabara for Mazan on the Dead Sea. In the Jerusalem-based journey, Jesus is leaving Bethabara for Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee. Of course, Jesus' destination had to contain water, because he uses the expression fishers of men, and it is implied that Peter and Andrew were fishermen. But actually, Peter and Andrew were fishers of men, for there was this ceremony where men would go into the water and be pulled out by nets onto the boat, as if they were being rescued by Noah as sinners. And after this they would be baptized by the priest, who was standing on the jetty, appearing to be walking on water. Jesus has now reached his destination at Mazan on the Dead Sea. We will now switch to the Jerusalem-based Jesus on his way to Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee, which is already in progress. It can be noted in John that Andrew and the other disciple, who was actually John Mark, the beloved disciple, were the ones who left John the Baptist for Jesus. And obviously Andrew brought Peter with him, and John Mark brought Philip. The other two were James and John, who were actually illegitimate children of the Emperor of Rome. And they had been adopted by Helena, who was the consort of Simon Magus. And thus Jesus acquired them, because when he married Mary Magdalene, who was the daughter of Helena, they then became brothers of his wife. Jesus is now 30 hours into the journey, and we'll jump ahead to 65 hours, where Jesus is just at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, and he has to walk around the eastern edge of the Sea of Galilee to get to Bethsaida. Jesus has now reached his destination at Bethsaida, and it should be noted that Bethsaida is not actually on the Sea of Galilee. It is just north of the Sea of Galilee. Now, whether this was true in older times or not is unknown, but perhaps this is proof that Mazan on the Dead Sea is the actual area where Jesus taught the disciples. It took 140.91 kilometers and 78.28 hours. For the Qumran-based Jesus, it was only 25 kilometers in just under 14 hours. I hope you enjoyed this Jesus Journey animation. Hello again, everyone. Glad that you are following my Jesus Journey series. Episode 7 has to do with the healing of the Canaanite woman and her daughter. These two healings are related to each other and need to be taken together. Now we're setting up the journey from Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee to Tyre and Sidon, actually to Sidon because it's closer. Now we're setting up the journey from Ein Feshka to Mird, because Mird is the place where the Asher convent is located, and Helena is the leader of that convent, and she is from Tyre and Sidon. Ready, set, go, and they're off. Jesus sets out from Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee, and he heads north to Sidon. Jesus has already arrived at Mird from Ein Feshka, so we will cut to that journey now. Jesus has reached Mird, and he will be visiting the convent of Asher as we resume the journey of Jesus going north to Sidon. Solving the identities of the Canaanite woman and daughter requires a lot of detective work. First, there is a clue in the Clementines which defines the mother of the daughter as Helena. Clementines have been dismissed as a pseudo-romance, but actually a lot of the information there can be tracked to the New Testament and other sources. So the Clementines tell us that Helena was the consort of Simon Magus, and of course Simon Magus is one of the disciples, and he is listed specifically as a Canaanite. The healing of the Syrophoenician Canaanite woman is in Matthew and Mark, and the healing of the woman with the issue of blood is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and this healing is associated with the raising of Jairus' daughter. The woman with the issue of blood is not specifically identified as Canaanite, but it is the one that is associated with the healing of Jairus' daughter. And thinking it through, you could understand that if Jairus' daughter was 12, and this was a symbolic raising from the dead, in other words, it was now Mary Magdalene's bat mitzvah. If the woman who was having the issue of blood for 12 years was the mother of the daughter, defined as Mary Magdalene here, having her bat mitzvah, how could it be that she had an issue of blood for 12 years? Well, that would indicate that she had remained a virgin since the birth of her daughter. The question arises, of course, is why she would need a healing from Jesus if she has been a virgin for 12 years. What is it that she needed to be forgiven for by Jesus? And this has to do with the history of Helena, because she was actually a temple priestess and was tricked into having sexual relations at the temple, and therefore feels guilty about the fact that her daughter really has no father. As you see, Jesus has been waiting patiently at the borders of Tyre and Sidon. He would have a much larger journey if he was really going to the cities of Tyre and Sidon. So perhaps you will allow me to just finish the story of the Syrophoenician woman and her daughter, who are Helena and Mary Magdalene. And then we can look at the statistics for the two journeys. Luke 8 says that Mary, called Magdalene, had 7 demons, of which Jesus had cured. So in the healing of the Syrophoenician's daughter, the daughter can be defined as Mary Magdalene, because this daughter had a demon, and the mother already has been defined as Helena. If you look at the dialogue between Helena and Jesus, you will see that Helena is making a point that she and the women need to have their status raised so that they can be active members of his church. And this obviously would be the first step that would be necessary for Jesus to marry Mary Magdalene. So this healing is quite significant, because it was almost like a marriage proposal from Helena to Jesus for Mary Magdalene. Now we can get back to the statistics for the journey to Tyre and Sidon. The Jerusalem-based journey was 50.78 kilometers in 28.21 hours. The Qumran-based journey was 6.44 kilometers in 4 hours. Hello again, everyone. Glad that you are following my Jesus Journeys series. Episode 8 is called Peter's Conundrum because it represents a situation that seems illogical. In Capernaum, Jesus gets into a boat to go to Bethsaida. When the people see him, they run along the shoreline like sheep to Bethsaida, but Jesus arrives after them. However, when one analyzes the Qumran area, one realizes that there are 3 routes from Mird to the Qumran area. One goes from Mird to Qumran, the other one from Mird to Ain Feshka, and the other one from Mird to Mazin. It would appear that in this case, the people went to Ain Feshka, and Jesus chose the lower route to Mazin, and then took a boat from Mazin to Ain Feshka, and this would explain the conundrum. Setting up the people represented by sheep, going along the shore from Capernaum to Bethsaida. Now setting up Jesus, going by boat from Capernaum to Bethsaida. Ready, set, go, and they're off. The people set off walking. Jesus sets off sailing. And here are the statistics. Jesus arrived 3 hours before the people, and thus the conundrum. Setting up the people represented by sheep going by land from Mird to Feshka. And now setting up Jesus going from Mird to Mazan by land and by boat to Feshka. Ready, set, go, and they're off. The people represented by sheep are leaving from Mird to Feshka. Jesus is leaving by land from Mird to Mazan. Now Jesus is sailing north from Mazan to Feshka. And now for the statistics. The people went from Mird to Feshka in 4 hours. Jesus' journey by land and sea took 5.72 hours. So clearly this Qumran location solves Peter's conundrum, because Jesus arrives after the people. And this shows emphatically that the Qumran location is the correct location for Jesus. And after this, with all the people gathered together, there was the miracle of the 5,000. Actually, it wasn't a miracle at all, but rather a symbolic representation of the hierarchy. And this event was the raising in status of John, the twin brother of James, who was now made leader of the 5,000 married Gentile men. Glad that you are following my Jesus Journeys series. Episode 9 shows the trip that Jesus took on a donkey from Bethany to Jerusalem, which is celebrated on Palm Sunday. Although the Jerusalem-centered and the Qumran-centered journeys have the same length, what is important to note is the fact that the plural word for Jerusalem is being used, and therefore this refers directly to Jerusalem, that is Qumran. It can be found that there are actually two word forms, the singular noun of Jerusalem standing for Jerusalem proper, and the plural form standing for Qumran. Setting up the journey from Bethany to the Jerusalem temple. Now setting up the journey from Feshka to the Qumran temple. Ready, set, go, and they're off. The Jerusalem-based journey begins from Bethany. The Qumran-based journey begins from Feshka. And here are the results. Both trips are tied at 3.6 kilometers and 1.20 hours. This shows that in the Qumran-centered location, Feshka is a good substitute for Bethany. Hello again, everyone. Glad that you are following my Jesus Journeys series. Episode 10 is on the Crucifixion. And here the journey to the cross is not all that important, but what is important is the location of Jerusalem. In the previous episode on Palm Sunday, we showed that the Jerusalem there was the plural form and therefore Qumran. After Palm Sunday, up to the resurrection at the caves, there are no verses that contain a Jerusalem that shows a location, other than two from Mark and Luke above. And these are in the plural form of Jerusalem, and therefore this indicates that the crucifixion had to have happened at Qumran. It can be found that there are actually two word forms, the singular noun of Jerusalem standing for Jerusalem proper, and the plural form standing for Qumran. Here are the traditional stations of the cross along Via Dolorosa. And here in Qumran, it's really just a few steps away from the temple area to the latrine area, which is marked by a skull. Using an arbitrary person speed of 20 meters per hour for carrying the cross, just for comparison purposes, it shows 2.5 hours to carry the cross. In Jerusalem and in Qumran, it just takes 10 minutes. Hello again, everyone. Glad that you are following my Jesus Journeys series. Episode 11 is the road to Emmaus. It is the last episode of this series. This is where the resurrected Jesus meets two men on the road, and they are surprised to find out that he doesn't know anything that has been going on in Jerusalem. Eventually they do discover that it is Jesus. Amazingly, this is the real Jesus, having survived the crucifixion. Fortunately, his legs were not broken when he was taken off the cross. And he is making this long journey from Qumran to Jerusalem. Now, Emmaus is the midpoint between Qumran and Jerusalem, and one makes it basically in 4 stages. You go from Ein Feshka to Mird, and then from Mird to the place where Masaba is located, which is Emmaus, and then from there to Bethany, and then from Bethany to Jerusalem. Jesus sets out from Ein Feshka to Mird. Jesus sets out from Mird to Emmaus, which is where Masaba is located. On the way he meets James, who is Cleopas, and Thaddeus, who is the unnamed person, and they talk for a long time, not recognizing Jesus. At Emmaus they stay at the monastery there and finally recognize Jesus. On the next day they set out from Emmaus to Bethany. Now leaving from Bethany to Jerusalem. The total journey from Ein Feshka to Jerusalem was 31.15 kilometers, and the journey took 17.3 hours. I hope you enjoyed this Jesus Journey animation, and if you would like to watch more of them, please go to the playlist at the top of the screen.